A routine traffic stop, or maybe a setup, ends with a black woman shoved and kicked to the ground by a deputy who thinks she's powerless. But the second his boot hits her leg, he sets off a chain of events he'll never be able to stop. Because the woman he just assaulted, she's not just any traveler, she's a federal inspector with access, leverage, and a long memory. What begins in silence turns into a sweeping investigation, exposing a web of corruption that stretches from small-town deputies to high-ranking officials. And when she stands back up, it's not just personal, it's the start of a reckoning. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. We're listening. It was the kind of afternoon that clings to your skin, thick with heat, humming with silence, the kind that makes you listen harder just to be sure the world's still breathing. The highway had thinned into two cracked lanes, shoulder barely wide enough for a mailbox, with fields of yellow grass stretching out like worn canvas in every direction. Lena Whitaker had been driving for hours, her old sedan humming beneath her like a tired animal, steady and quiet, just the way she liked it. The road signs had stopped showing city names a while back. Now they just read things like fresh eggs or last gas 12 miles. She didn't care. She wasn't lost. She was where she meant to be. When she pulled into the station, it looked half abandoned, like it hadn't decided whether to give up or hold on another year. A single gas pump leaned forward like it had something to confess, its faded plastic casing, sun-warped and brittle. The only sound was the buzzing of a broken Coke machine and the slow ticking of her engine cooling down. Lena stepped out slowly, one hand on the roof, the other reaching for her wallet, her joints aching just enough to remind her that 58 wasn't 48 and that a lifetime of public service left its marks, whether people saw them or not. She wore what she always wore on the road, loose gray slacks, a white blouse with rolled sleeves and a wide-brimmed straw hat that kept the sun off her face but couldn't shield her eyes. Those eyes scanned everything quietly, the way a woman learns to do after years of seeing what others miss, of being seen and unseen, in ways that change depending on the zip code. She moved like someone who didn't want to draw attention but wouldn't tolerate being underestimated. She slid her credit card into the pump. Nothing happened. Tried again. Still dead. That's when she heard it, the crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate like a warning shot with no bullet. She didn't turn right away. Just let her fingers rest on the edge of the gas tank, her breathing measured, eyes narrowing behind her sunglasses. Then came the voice. "Afternoon, ma'am. You from around here?" Male southern drawl, the kind that could sound charming or threatening depending on what followed next. Lena turned slowly, keeping her hands visible, posture relaxed but alert. A sheriff's deputy had parked his cruiser at an angle close enough to crowd, far enough to claim it was just coincidence. He stepped out with a kind of casual authority that reeked of practice. Tall, solid, maybe mid-40s, pale skin, buzz-cut, mirrored sunglasses, hiding whatever wasn't welcome to be seen. "Just getting gas," Lena said, voice low. "But even the way you speak, when you've got nothing to hide, but everything to protect." The deputy stepped closer. "Station's closed. Owner passed last month. Ain't nobody been out here since." His tone was flat, but something behind it twisted like a nail bent the wrong way. Lena nodded once, didn't smile. "Didn't see a sign," she replied. "I'll be on my way." But he didn't move, just looked at her car, then back at her, his lips tightening as if solving a puzzle he didn't like the answer to. "Mind showing me some ID?" he asked, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see how far he could go before she pushed back. Lena held his gaze for a second longer than was polite. Then she reached into her back pocket slowly, deliberately, and handed him her driver's license. Not her badge. Not yet. He took it without a word, eyes scanning the plastic like he expected it to change while he stared at it. "You a long way from home, Miss Whitaker," he muttered, handing it back like it had burned his fingers. She pocketed it calm and unmoved. "Just needed to stretch my legs. That a problem?" For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them felt heavy like the seconds before a thunderstorm. Cicadas sang somewhere in the trees, loud and constant, filling the silence with a kind of pressure that made your ears ring. The deputy finally stepped back just half a pace, but enough to signal that he hadn't gotten what he came for. "Well," he said, adjusting his belt, "you be careful. These roads don't always treat strangers kindly." Lena didn't flinch. "I've seen worse," she said softly. She meant it. He gave her one last look like he was still deciding if she was trouble or just a fluke, then climbed back into his cruiser, the door slamming harder than it needed to. She waited until he pulled away dust, trailing behind his tires before she exhaled fully. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. This wasn't new, but that didn't mean it didn't weigh something. She looked back at the pump then, at the road stretching out ahead. The station may have been dead, but her instincts weren't. And in that brief encounter, something had shifted not in him but in her. A pressure. A flicker. A whisper in her gut that this wouldn't be the last time she'd hear his voice. She slid back into her car, shut the door quietly, and turned the key. The engine rumbled back to life. Outside, the sky hadn't changed, but something in the air had. And Lena Whitaker knew better than to ignore a storm building on the horizon. She hadn't driven more than a quarter-mile before she saw the same cruiser in her rearview mirror headlights, too close, too deliberate, like it had never really left. Lena kept her hands steady on the wheel, her gaze forward, her breath tucked neatly behind her ribs. The road curved gently through a stretch of scrub and cottonwood, the trees casting long, uneven shadows that flickered across her windshield like ghosts trying to wave her down. Her knee ached from the hours behind the wheel, but she didn't dare shift too much, didn't want to give the man behind her any reason to believe she was nervous, even though she was starting to feel the old pressure in her chest, the kind that told her she was no longer just a traveler passing through. When the blue lights snapped on, her reaction was quiet, almost mechanical. She slowed down, signaled, and pulled onto a patch of gravel that crackled like dry bones beneath her tires. She put the car in park, rolled down her window halfway, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, her fingers lightly tapping against the leather like they were keeping time with a song no one else could hear. In the side mirror, she watched him approach slow steps, hand resting too easily on the grip of his holstered weapon, his chin tilted in a way that didn't suggest curiosity, but expectation. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he said flat, and without preamble, like it was routine, like she was already guilty of something. Lena didn't move right away. "Is there a reason for the stop?" she asked calmly, the tone of a woman who's learned to ask questions like shields, not challenges. He didn't answer at first. Just leaned down a bit, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses that reflected nothing but her own face back at her. "You were swerving," he lied, his mouth twisting at the edge like he enjoyed the shape of the words. She could have argued, but she didn't. Not here. Not on this empty road with no witnesses and the sun starting to dip behind the trees. Instead, she nodded, once slow and clear, and reached to unbuckle her seatbelt, moving like a woman who'd practiced every step of this dance 100 times in the dark. She stepped out carefully, gravel shifting under her shoes, the dry air clinging to her like suspicion. The deputy towered over her now, his presence wide and deliberate, the kind of man who used his body the way some men use weapons without ever needing to raise his voice. "Mind popping the trunk?" he asked, voice almost casual now, but there was nothing idle in his posture, nothing relaxed in the way his fingers hovered a little too close to the buckle of his belt. "I do actually," Lena said, keeping her voice steady, her hands still visible, still calm. "I don't consent to a search without probable cause." She saw something flicker in his expression, then not surprise, not respect, just irritation at being challenged by someone who wasn't supposed to know the rules. "License and registration," he snapped, not because he needed them, but because the moment was slipping from his control. Lena opened her door, slowly retrieved the documents, and handed them over. He snatched them without a word, flipping them over like they were forged. "Lena Whitaker," he read aloud, as if her name tasted wrong in his mouth. "Where you headed, Lena?" She didn't answer right away, just let the silence stretch long enough to make a point. "Does that change whether I've broken the law?" she asked finally. He didn't like that. She could tell by the way his nostrils flared just slightly, the way he shifted his stance. "You got an attitude," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "I don't care for it." Then suddenly he stepped in close, too close, his boots scuffing the edge of her shoe, his breath sour with the taste of power. Lena didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood there, hands by her sides, eyes steady on his like a wire pulled taut between them. "You need to step back," she said, quiet and direct. That was the moment. The fuse. His hand moved fast, not to his weapon but to her shoulder, shoving her backward with a force meant to humiliate, not subdue. She stumbled, caught herself on the edge of her open car door, the metal biting into her palm. Unnecessary, she hissed through clenched teeth, the pain flaring but her voice firm. But he wasn't done. He reached into her car without asking, rummaging through the glove compartment like he owned it, tossing papers and receipts aside with the indifference of someone who thought consequences were for other people. Lena's pulse thudded in her ears, but she didn't stop him, not yet. She knew how these things worked, how the wrong reaction at the wrong time could end up written in chalk on the side of the road. "There's a registration card in there," she said, pointing. "Top folder in the envelope." He found it, crumpled it in his fist, and looked back at her like she'd insulted him by following the rules. That's when it happened. Without a word, without a flicker of warning, he raised one boot and drove it into her shin. Hard. Bone meeting bone. Pain slicing through muscle like lightning. She gasped, falling hard onto the gravel, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs and the confidence from her knees. Above her, he stood smirking, his shadow long and ugly across her face. "That's where you belong," he muttered, turning his back like it meant nothing, like she was nothing. And just like that he was gone, his cruiser rolling away tires, spitting dust as if they were doing her a favor. Lena stayed on the ground for a beat longer than she needed to, not because she was weak, but because she was thinking, calculating, measuring the weight of what had just happened. Then she pushed herself up with a quiet grunt. Her hand scraped her leg, already swelling, her breath shallow but solid. The sky above was bruised purple, now the sun sinking low, but inside her something else had started to rise. Not just rage, not just pain, something older, sharper. A storm gathering its own name. And Lena Whitaker, she was done waiting for permission to fight back. The moment his boot struck her shin time, didn't slow down, it sharpened. Pain sudden and electric shot up Lena's leg and bloomed in her knee like fire beneath the skin. The ground hit her fast and without mercy, gravel tearing through fabric and flesh, the hard slap of her body echoing in the still, dry air. The taste of dust filled her mouth as she struggled to catch her breath, one hand digging into the earth for balance, the other curled around her ribs in a reflex to shield herself from more. But nothing came next. No further blow, no handcuffs, no arrest. Just silence, broken only by the sound of her gas cap clinking, shut the pump, still ticking behind her, fuel dripping slow onto cracked pavement. She looked up, blinking through pain and dust, and saw him, Deputy Travis Hensley, already walking away like he'd stepped on a bug and thought nothing of it. His shoulders were loose, casual, his stride relaxed in the way only someone protected by power could walk. He didn't look back, didn't check if she was hurt, didn't care if she was breathing. "Stay down," he muttered without turning around, just loud enough for her to hear, like it was a punchline to a private joke, only he found funny. Lena pressed her palm to the ground, wincing as sharp pebbles bit into her skin, then slowly pushed herself upright, her body trembling not from weakness but from restraint. The pressure in her chest wasn't fear, it was fury held tightly in place, folded and buried beneath layers of training, memory, and years of knowing exactly how far a situation could tilt when a black woman stood up too soon. She didn't cry, didn't groan. Her face stayed calm, unreadable, the way you learn to keep it when the world treats your dignity like an inconvenience. Across the lot, a teenage boy stood frozen near a stack of empty soda crates. He was maybe 16, maybe younger, skinny, with a crooked ball cap and a phone held low by his hip. His fingers shook, but the lens was pointed steady, catching the whole thing. Lena saw him. More importantly, she saw the red record light blinking. He looked scared, not just for her, but for what he was doing. She gave him the smallest nod, just a shift of her chin, and he seemed to understand. He didn't move, didn't speak, just kept filming. Deputy Hensley climbed into his cruiser, slammed the door, shut hard enough to make the glass rattle, and turned the key with a snarl of ignition. The engine revved like an animal being dared to charge, tires screeching as he tore out of the lot, gravel spitting behind him like spit in her direction. And then he was gone. No apology, no paperwork, no badge number offered. Just dust, silence, and the sound of injustice slipping away under a red and blue light bar. Lena stood still for a moment, one hand gripping the edge of her SUV door, the other resting gently against her thigh. Her leg pulsed with heat, her jeans torn at the knee, a slow, dark stain spreading beneath the fabric. But she wasn't thinking about the pain. Not yet. She was thinking about how quickly it had happened. How little it had taken for him to decide she was worth less than his comfort, less than his ego. He hadn't asked who she was, hadn't cared what she did for a living. All he saw was a black woman alone in a nice car, and that was enough. Her phone buzzed from inside her jacket, the vibration cutting through the thick silence like a sudden knock at the door. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen and saw the name Briggs, Durr, comms secure. No photo, just white letters against a black background. She answered on the first ring. "Whitaker," she said, voice tight. "Lena, are you okay?" the voice on the other end asked sharp with urgency. "We got a geo alert ping off your last secure badge check." Something happened. Lena's eyes flicked to the edge of the lot where the boy was still standing, his phone now raised a little higher, a silent witness holding more than he realized. "Yeah," she said softly. "I was assaulted. Kicked by a sheriff's deputy. Unprovoked. It's all on civilian video." There was a pause on the line, then a clipped breath. "Do you want to activate?" She looked down at her leg at the blood beginning to bead at the seam. "Yes," she said. "Pull every internal complaint on Hensley. Cross-check transfers, partners, suspension history, and start a background trace on the station's supervisor. I want to know who gave him that badge." "Copy that," the voice said. "We're moving." Then the line went dead. Lena lowered the phone, then turned toward the boy. He looked hesitant, like he was waiting for permission, unsure if he was about to help or make things worse. She limped over slowly, each step sending a new wave of ache up her shin, her body protesting, her mind already leaving the pain behind. When she reached him, she nodded once, not with gratitude but with clarity. "Did you get all of it?" she asked, not accusing, just cert. He nodded. Yeah, I think so," he stammered. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did the right thing," she said, and her voice, while calm, held a weight that made him stand straighter. "Send it everywhere." He blinked. "You sure?" Lena glanced back at the gas station, at the pump still hanging from her car like a forgotten thread, then down at the blood drying on her leg. "3 minutes ago, I wasn't a story," she said quietly. "Now I am. Let's make it count." The boy nodded again, then turned and began tapping at his phone, his thumbs moving fast, as if they understood the urgency, even if he didn't. Lena watched him for a moment, then limped back to her SUV. She eased into the driver's seat, her muscles stiff, her breath shallow, and reached for the small pouch tucked beneath her dashboard. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, was her badge. Not just any badge, Federal Inspector General Law Enforcement Oversight Division. She didn't pull it out yet. Not now, not here. She just sat there for a while, eyes closed, fingers curled around the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle around her like dust. Somewhere down the road, sirens were starting to rise. Somewhere in the cloud, a video was already on its way to becoming viral. But here in this moment, Lena Whitaker wasn't thinking about the crowd or the law or even the pain. She was thinking about the look on his face when he walked away, and how he had no idea what he'd just done. Not yet. But soon, and when the reckoning came, it would arrive like her, quiet, precise, and absolutely unstoppable. By the time Lena pulled out of that cracked, sun-bleached parking lot, the burn in her leg had faded to a deep, dull throb. Less fire, more weight, like carrying something too long that no one else could see. Her hand stayed steady on the wheel, but her mind was moving fast already, scanning through the right contacts, the right channels, the right phrases that wouldn't just document what had happened, but would set something in motion. The road ahead unspooled like ribbon under a tightening storm, the cottonwoods on either side whispering in a breeze that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. She didn't play music, didn't call a friend. She just drove, eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses, her silence, not of retreat but of precision. 15 minutes later, she rolled into the kind of roadside diner that survives more off-routine than customers, its neon sign flickering between open and op, like even the electricity had given up halfway. She parked in the back behind a pickup with mismatched doors and a trailer hitch rusted to bone. When she stepped out, her leg buckled slightly, but she gritted her teeth, pulled her jacket tighter, and walked like a woman whose limp wasn't weakness but warning. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and old vinyl, the booths faded to the color of dried blood, and the woman behind the counter didn't say a word, just looked up once, clocked the damage in Lena's gait, and poured her a cup without asking. Lena slid into the farthest booth, back to the wall view of the front entrance, the way she always sat when the world started to tilt sideways. The coffee tasted like rust and bitterness, but it was hot, and in that moment heat felt like control. She took a slow sip, exhaled, then pulled her phone out and unlocked a secure app, the interface cold and gray, a blinking prompt waiting for instructions. She typed fast the way someone does when pain is the least urgent thing on their mind. The message was simple: activate internal trace. Subject: Deputy Travis Hensley, Benton County. Cross-check IA partner history, flagged complaints. She hit send. No fanfare, no noise, just action. A few seconds passed before the response lit up her screen. Trace confirmed. Pulling files now. Network trace on command staff initiated. Secondary contact alerted. Lena leaned back, closed her eyes for one breath, and let the hum of the diner wrap around her like an old thin blanket. She didn't need sympathy. She needed data, and soon it would come. Then the phone rang, not the personal line, not even the bureau-issued one. This came from her satellite line one. Only 5 people knew. She answered without hesitation. Whitaker. A voice came through, clipped and familiar. Lena, it's Harold. Got the ping. You okay? I've had worse, she said, shifting slightly to ease pressure on her bruised leg. But this wasn't random, Harold. This guy didn't just get aggressive, he assumed he could do it without consequence. Benton County, he asked, already pulling up files on his end. That's McMillan's old district, isn't it? Thought she retired. She did, replaced by a Sheriff Caulfield. 3 terms, 0 public complaints. Which means something's being buried. Harold exhaled, the sound of fingers clacking over keys faint in the background. Pulling his department history now. You want me to light it up or stay quiet? Quiet for now, she said, eyes watching the window. But start a shadow inquiry. I want a list of deputies flagged for excessive force and how long it took to clear them. You got it. She hung up and set the phone down gently on the table, fingers resting against the chipped ceramic mug as if to ground herself. The ache in her leg was spreading now, creeping into her hip like a cold settling into bone, but she welcomed it. Pain had always sharpened her focus, not dulled it. A minute later, her screen lit up again. A new file had arrived. She opened it and scanned the first few entries. Hensley had 4 complaints, all closed within 10 days. 2 use-of-force incidents. 1 alleged racial profiling. 1 unlawful vehicle search. All dismissed. Lena's mouth tightened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Patterns don't hide for long if you know where to look. She began drafting a report, nothing official, just notes for herself. Subject profile: Hensley. Behavioral escalation consistent with unchecked power. Pattern of impunity supported by internal silence. Then a second file popped through. This one carried the seal of the inspector's office, flagged red. A financial audit from 6 months ago showed equipment procurement discrepancies, body cameras ordered but not logged. Lena raised an eyebrow. Cameras missing, complaints buried. A sheriff running unopposed for over a decade. She was starting to see the roots. The waitress finally approached, quiet and careful. You want a refill? Lena looked up, read the concern behind the woman's neutral expression, and nodded once. Please. You need anything else? She asked, eyes flicking toward the bruising beneath Lena's slacks. Lena met her gaze. No, she said, but thank you. When the woman left, Lena slid her badge from her inner coat pocket and laid it on the table. She didn't need to flash it, didn't need to prove anything, but it was there, a reminder not to others, but to herself, that this wasn't personal anymore. This was official, and that changed everything. Outside, the sky was starting to darken into lavender. The day hadn't ended, but it had turned. Lena stared through the glass at her reflection, faint and warped by the neon glow, and felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, not like a burden, but like armor. She had choices to make, files to dig, a system to unravel, one thread at a time. But for now, in that small diner with a cheap mug and a bruised leg, she allowed herself one full breath, one moment of stillness, because once she left that booth, the quiet would end and the reckoning would begin. By the time Lena stepped out of the diner and into the thick lavender dusk, the air had shifted less like evening, settling more like something holding its breath. The sky was streaked with rose and ash, and the horizon glowed faintly gold, like the sun had reluctantly agreed to end its watch. Her leg ached with a steady thudding rhythm now, not sharp but present, as if it needed her to remember what had been taken from her, even if it only lasted seconds. She moved slowly but purposefully to her car, her jaw tight, her thoughts sharper than they had been all day. She sank into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and sat still for a beat, the vinyl creaking under her weight, her fingers curled around the wheel, not to drive but to ground herself. The phone on the passenger seat buzzed twice, then again notifications rolling in like a tide. She didn't need to check right away. She knew what they were. The boy had done what she asked. The video was out. She picked up the phone, unlocked it, and watched as the screen bloomed with chaos. Clips of the incident had already surfaced on multiple platforms: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, shared by accounts she didn't recognize, but whose captions all carried a similar weight. "This is America. He didn't know who she was. Share before it's deleted." The video itself was raw and grainy, the angle just off-center, but it captured everything: the shove, the kick, the smirk, her fall, and most haunting of all, her silence. Lena tapped into the main thread where the clip had gone viral. The comments came fast, tens of thousands of them, some angry, some stunned, some disbelieving. One read, "Who kicks someone like that? She didn't even move." Another simply said, "Who is she?" And that question kept repeating, "Who is she? Who is she? Who is she?" Like the country was waiting to find out whether what happened was injustice or just another headline. Lena felt a strange mix of detachment and focus, as if the video showed someone else's life, but her own pulse was the one echoing in its wake. She opened her contact list, scrolled past names she hadn't touched in months, then stopped at one Marcus Red, Fedcom's Tactical. She hit dial. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight but unsurprised. "Lena, it's you. You've seen it?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Oh yeah," he replied. "It's on fire. Twitter's clocked 200,000 retweets in the last hour. You're the top trending tag. Anonymous sources are already speculating your bureau." She exhaled slow. "Good! Let them!" He hesitated. "You sure you want to ride this one out loud?" Lena looked out the windshield, watched the wind stir dust into low spirals near the diner sign. "I didn't ask for the spotlight, Marcus, but I'm not backing away from it either." A brief pause. Then he said, "Understood. I'll start the perimeter scrub, see who's sniffing around, keep an eye on trolls and smear jobs. Pull complaint records on Benton County's department," she added. "Cross-reference with internal affairs audit cycles. If there's dirt, it'll be buried in timing. I'm already on it." She hung up not because she didn't trust him to handle it, but because there were still more calls to make. One to an old field agent in St. Louis, who had a habit of finding data no one wanted found. Another to a civil rights attorney in Atlanta who'd once won a lawsuit against a police department in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight. And one more to Denise, her closest legal contact and former task force partner, who always answered on the first ring when things got serious. "Tell me you're not calling because I just saw your face on my screen," Denise said, her voice half amused, half already armed. "I'm calling, Lena," said her voice quiet but firm, "because it's real. And I need your brain when this goes federal." There was a beat. Then Denise replied, "You got it. Whatever you need." The last thing Lena did before turning the engine over was forward the video to one more destination, her encrypted cloud account. Not just for safekeeping, but because she knew better than to trust any one platform. She added a note beneath the file name, "Primary Evidence, Civil Rights Violation, Unprovoked Assault, Time Code 1742, CST." As the car rumbled to life, she felt a shift not in the world outside, which still looked quiet and still, but inside her. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even rage. It was certainty that this was the moment. That after years of watching these stories unfold for other people in other towns on other screens, it had landed squarely at her feet. But unlike so many before her, she wasn't going to disappear. And maybe, just maybe, that's why it scared them. Because this time the woman on the ground didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even flinch. She got up. She walked away. And now she was coming back with names, evidence, and the force of a system they thought was theirs alone. As she pulled back onto the highway, the sky behind her darkened to a rich blue stars peeking through like witnesses blinking awake. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a television crackled through an open window. Somewhere else, a sheriff was settling into his evening, thinking the worst was over. Lena didn't smile, but something in her gaze tightened, a quiet fire flickering beneath her calm. They didn't know who she was, but they were about to find out. Lena drove through the darkness like someone tracing fault lines on a map, slow, steady, and absolutely sure that every mile forward was one closer to the truth. The highway was almost empty now, just the occasional 18-wheeler rumbling past in the opposite lane, headlights cutting like silent judgments across her windshield. Her fingers tapped the wheel in a rhythm that wasn't nervous. It was purposeful, the way someone keeps time while calculating, while watching the ground shift beneath their feet. Her leg still throbbed, stiff from swelling, but she didn't stop. The pain reminded her that this wasn't a story unfolding in headlines or hashtags. This was her body, her bruises, her blood, She pulled into a motel just past the county line, one of those low-slung, sun-bleached places with peeling paint, and a sign that flickered as if embarrassed to still be open. She paid in cash at the window, gave no name, and took the room key without a word. Room 7. End unit. No connecting wall. One way in, one way out. Just how she liked it. Inside, the air was stale with old pine-scented cleaner and decades of resignation, but the lock worked, and the curtains were thick enough to keep out questions. She dropped her bag on the chair and opened her laptop on the wobbly table by the window, the glow from the screen throwing shadows up the wall like tall, silent witnesses. Files were already waiting. Marcus had sent them, and he didn't waste time. She opened the first document and felt her jaw tighten as the pieces began to slide into place. 4 internal complaints against Hensley, as expected, all dismissed within 10 days. 3 of the complainants were under 30, all people of color. One was a local nurse, cited for a broken taillight, then arrested for aggressive posture. No citations, no court dates, just paper trails that disappeared. She kept reading. The sheriff, Marianne Caulfield, had signed off on every dismissal personally. No disciplinary action recorded, not even a warning. Lena cross-checked complaint dates with county board meeting logs. Nothing. No mention. No oversight. Just a clean record polished to the point of fiction. She opened another file and found something that stopped her cold. Caulfield had received over $50,000 in campaign contributions from 2 construction firms and a private security contractor. That contractor had recently installed a new surveillance system at the county jail, an unbid contract approved by internal memo and funded with emergency funds from the state. Lena leaned back, her eyes scanning the pattern, not of negligence but design. This wasn't a rogue officer and a complacent boss. This was infrastructure, a system built to fold wrongdoing into paperwork to hide corruption inside routine. Every complaint silenced, every document closed quietly, every donor connected by more than just money. These people weren't just defending each other, they were feeding each other. "It's a machine," she muttered under her breath, her voice low tight with realization. "And no one's ever made them bleed." She clicked over to her encrypted messaging app and typed out a message to Marcus. "Pull every audit on Caulfield's office in the last 5 years. Cross with vendor contracts and any state-level political donations. Include judicial reviews where applicable. Also check where those donors send PAC money. I want to know who benefits when she gets re-elected." She hit send and rubbed her temples, her fingers pressing into the ache that had been building since the sun went down. Outside, somewhere beyond the buzzing neon of the motel sign, thunder rolled across the sky like a warning too slow to stop anything. The air smelled of ozone and gasoline and something Lena couldn't name but had learned to recognize: pressure. She stood slowly, stretched her back, and walked to the bathroom where she ran cold water over a washcloth and pressed it to her leg. The bruise had deepened to a plum-colored stain, jagged and ugly against her skin. She stared at it in the mirror, not with fear, not even with anger, but with clarity. That mark wasn't just proof of assault. It was the crack in the wall, and Lena was going to widen it until the whole rotten structure came crashing down. She returned to the table and opened a blank document titled "Pattern of Misconduct, Preliminary Findings." She began typing, her fingers quick but deliberate, each sentence a thread tightening around someone who thought they'd never be questioned. She documented the complaints, the dismissals, the matching names between donors and contract recipients, the names of judges who threw out civil suits on technicalities, and the internal affairs officer whose name appeared in every no misconduct found summary. By the time she stopped, the document was over 1,000 words long, and it was only the beginning. She saved it under 3 locations, encrypted each one, and backed them to 2 secure drives. Then she shut the laptop, leaned back in the chair, and let the silence take up space for a minute. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that comes just before you strike the match. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Marcus working. "Something stinks. Found a judge with sealed complaints, too. Will update." She typed back one word: "dig." Then she turned off the light, sat in the dark with her hands folded, and listened. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. And when it did, she planned to be ready, not with fury, not with fire, but with facts, with names, with chains of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Because what happened to her wasn't a mistake, it was procedure. And that meant someone had designed it that way. And if they built the system, she could unbuild it, piece by piece, name by name, step by step, until there was nothing left to hide behind. Lena didn't sleep much that night, not because of the pain in her leg, though it throbbed with a dull persistence, but because her mind wouldn't let go of the shape the truth was beginning to take. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't weigh on your muscles, but on your conscience, the kind that hums behind your eyes and whispers, "You're not done yet." She lay on top of the motel blanket, fully clothed, one hand behind her head, the other resting on her stomach, watching the ceiling, like it might reveal one more detail she'd missed. The night outside had turned thick and still, as if the air itself were holding back, waiting to see what she'd do next. At 4:03 a.m., her phone buzzed once Marcus. The message was short, "You need to see this." Below it, a secure link. She sat up slowly, reached for the laptop on the table, and opened the file in silence. It was a memo dated 6 months ago, written by a mid-level officer in Benton County, recommending Deputy Hensley for temporary leave due to a pattern of escalating force incidents. The memo had been countersigned for receipt by Sheriff Caulfield and marked "Overruled, no follow-up needed." That single red stamp made Lena's stomach turn, not out of surprise but out of certainty. They hadn't ignored the problem. They knew it, documented it, and left it on the shelf like an old injury they didn't want to treat. She sent a response. "Confirm source. We may have our first internal crack." Marcus wrote back instantly, "Whistleblower. Transferred out of state 2 months later. Quiet reassignment. Doesn't want to go public yet, but he's watching. Says he'll share more if we move smart." Lena leaned back, her pulse low and steady, the kind of rhythm that always came before a decision. She stood up, limped to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and stared into the mirror. Really stared this time, not at the tiredness or the bruises, but at the steadiness beneath them. "They knew," she said aloud, her voice rough with dawn. "And they left him on the street." By 6 a.m. she'd checked out of the motel, left no name, no trace, and drove east on a quiet state road where the mist hadn't burned off yet. The sky was a pale smear of gray, the kind of morning that felt like it hadn't made up its mind. She passed old farms, broken fences, a shuttered church with a tilted steeple, and somewhere between silence and static, she made a choice. No more waiting, no more documenting in the dark. It was time to set a trap. She called Marcus. "I want them to come to us," she said, voice even. "We'll feed them something they can't resist." "Fake intel?" he asked, already catching on. "Something they think we have. Something they'll want to stop before it spreads." He paused. "You sure you want to draw them out like that?" Lena looked out the windshield at a crow perched on a mile marker, its head cocked like it was listening. They already made the first move. They just didn't realize it was war. By noon, they'd laid the groundwork, an encrypted trail seeded through a burner account, whispers of a supposed meeting between Lena and a DOJ special investigator at a courthouse just outside county lines. The building was real, but long, unused, dusty benches, cracked marble floors, and echoes that hadn't heard footsteps in years. Lena arrived first, dressed simply, her badge tucked deep inside her coat, carrying a decoy bag filled with blank files and a drive with nothing but static. Marcus watched from across the street, stationed in an old plumbing van rigged with audio and visual surveillance. At exactly 4:37 p.m., the first car rolled in, a black SUV with no plates, followed by a second sedan. 3 men stepped out, 2 in plain clothes, one with a sheriff's department radio still clipped to his belt. No insignia, no uniforms. Lena heard the door slam from 3 rooms away. She didn't move. She just sat at the end of the hall, near a broken window, hands resting on her lap, eyes steady on the door they were about to kick open. The wood splintered on the second hit, heavy boots crunching over tile, and then voices low, angry, controlled. "She's here," one of them said. "Grab the damn bag. Check everything." They didn't see the hidden cameras in the ceiling tiles, the microphones tucked behind the vent grates, or the lens tucked into Lena's coat button. They were too sure of themselves, too used to being the only ones doing the watching. One of the men found the bag, rifled through it, cursing under his breath when he saw nothing but decoys. That's when he turned and saw Lena sitting calmly at the far end of the hallway, her expression unreadable. "You think this is going to scare me?" she asked, voice low but clear. The man stepped forward like he meant to prove something. That's when Marcus made the call. 2 federal agents entered through the front with body armor, visible weapons drawn but pointed, low voices, sharp and rehearsed. Federal officers' hands where we can see them. The intruders froze. One of them raised his hands. The other didn't move fast enough. The third tried to speak but was cut off with zip cuffs and silence. Lena stood slowly, her legs stiff but her stance unshaken, and stepped forward with the small recording device still rolling in her hand. "You followed me," she said quietly. "Now you'll answer for it." Marcus entered behind the agents, gave her a look that wasn't pride but respect. "Worked like a charm," he said. "Of course it did," Lena replied. "They still think they're hunting. They don't realize they've been prey since Tuesday." As the men were let out in silence, Lena didn't feel satisfaction, just confirmation. This wasn't just about one crooked deputy anymore. It never had been. It was about the system that sent these men, trained them to believe they were untouchable, and expected the silence to hold. But the silence was broken now, and Lena intended to make sure it never came back. The courthouse emptied out slowly after the arrests, as if the old walls themselves were exhaling centuries of dust and secrecy they had kept for too long. Lena remained at the edge of the hallway, her back straight, her fingers tight around the handle of the recording device, her leg aching like a fuse that never quite burned out. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled into her bones yet. It wasn't adrenaline, and it wasn't relief. It was something heavier, more exacting. She wasn't proud. She wasn't even angry anymore. She was precise. What they'd walked into wasn't just a trap, it was a mirror. And everything they showed in that moment, arrogance, desperation, violence, was now documented, filed, and ready to burn. Marcus walked up beside her as she leaned against the worn stone column near the stairs, his eyes scanning her face the way soldiers do when the fighting's paused, but not over. "You all right?" he asked quietly, no drama in his tone, just steadiness. "I will be," she said. This was the middle, not the end. He nodded once, pulling a flash drive from his coat pocket and handing it to her. Clean footage from every angle. Time-stamped. Cross-verified. Already backed up in 3 secure locations. "You want it live?" She took it, turned it over in her palm like it was something alive, then slid it into her inner coat pocket. "Not yet. I want them to sweat a little first." Outside, the afternoon light was harsh and unkind, the kind of sunlight that exposes more than it warms. Protesters had begun to gather across the street, mostly locals, some press a few with handmade signs scrawled in bold strokes, "No more silence, fire Hensley. Where's the justice?" Lena stayed back from the window out of view, not because she was hiding, but because she needed one more moment to think without being watched. "Let's go," she said finally. "We've got work to do." Back at the field office, tucked behind a strip mall with faded signs and broken street lamps, Lena sat in a borrowed room lit by buzzing fluorescents and surrounded by legal pads, open files, and screens full of names that were beginning to connect like constellations. The board on the wall showed it plainly, Caulfield at the center, Hensley below her, contractors and donors to the left, internal affairs officers, and compromised judges to the right. But above her there were question marks, blank spaces where power lived without a name, still shielded behind layers of distance and plausible deniability. Marcus paced in the corner, phone pressed to his ear, murmuring in code to a contact Lena didn't need to know by name. She trusted Marcus not because he was flawless, but because he'd never once asked her to be quiet when things got loud. He finished the call, turned, and handed her a thin manila folder. "We've got movement," he said. "Sheriff Caulfield just gave a statement. Claims the department is fully cooperating with the investigation and that she's appalled by the incident." Lena raised an eyebrow. "She named me number just a concerned citizen. Said the matter was being overblown by social media." Lena scoffed under her breath, her hands tightening just slightly around the pen she'd been holding. "That's the playbook. Deny, distance, discredit." Marcus sat across from her, leaned in with elbows on the table. "We push now." She looked down at the notebook in front of her, the last sentence she'd written underlined twice in dark blue ink. This wasn't misconduct, it was maintenance. She tapped the page gently, then looked up. "Not yet. One more step." That night, in a quiet motel room 40 miles north of the city, Lena uploaded a 30-second clip to a private cloud and sent it to the same journalist who had first broken the video of her assault. The new footage was grainier, recorded from a hidden angle, but the audio was clear. One of the men caught at the courthouse, his voice full of venom and panic. "She's done. You hear me? Done!" There were no names spoken, but the threat was unmistakable, and the voice print had already been matched. Lena didn't sleep after that. She didn't even lie down. She just sat at the small round table by the window, lights off, listening to the low hum of cars passing by, the rhythm of late-night life that moved forward regardless of who bled. She wasn't scared. She wasn't even shaken, but she knew what was coming. She knew the silence that follows exposure is never empty. It's loaded, waiting, packed with retaliation wrapped in civility. The next morning the clip went public. It wasn't dramatic, not edited or stylized, just 30 seconds of audio laid over a dark screen with a simple caption. They sent men to threaten a woman who asked questions. Listen carefully. The post didn't need a name. Everyone who'd been paying attention already knew whose voice had stayed calm during the chaos. The internet did what it does when it senses injustice, and this time it didn't fragment. It roared. The hashtag trended again. National anchors picked it up. Civil rights organizations released statements. A senator called for oversight hearings. News trucks returned to the county courthouse like vultures that had smelled something sour in the soil. And in the center of it all, Lena stood back, not silent but steady, watching the system try to hold itself together with old tricks that no longer worked. She knew they'd come harder now, faster, meaner, maybe even smarter, but she also knew they were rattled. Because when a system that feeds on secrecy finds itself exposed, it doesn't strategize, it panics. Marcus handed her another folder that evening, a thick one, heavier than the others. "What's this?" she asked, her voice low. "A name," he said. "We've been circling it for days. All the money ties back to a senator, Everett Grayson." She nodded slowly, already sensing the shift in scale. State oversight, chairs the committee. Used to be a cop. Now he signs off on every grant that funds departments like Caulfields. Lena took the folder, opened it, and started to read, not like someone reviewing evidence, but like someone reading the blueprint of a building they now had permission to demolish. "They built this like it would never crack," she whispered. "They forgot one thing." Marcus looked at her across the dim room. "What's that?" "They built it on the assumption no one would ever push back this hard. And she was just getting started." The next few days moved like a storm system, rolling slow over the hills, quiet at first, almost gentle but full of a pressure that made your skin itch before the lightning ever came. Lena barely left the cabin she'd relocated to a one-bedroom rental tucked behind a bait shop off an old two-lane highway where the only sound at night was the wind knocking dry pine branches against the window pane. It was the kind of place you could disappear into without vanishing, just far enough from town that no one asked questions, but close enough that the cell signal still held. Inside the table was covered with files, flash drives, scribbled legal pads, and coffee cups that never quite made it back to the sink. Lena stood most of the time, pacing slow, talking to herself in short, clipped sentences, as if testing which truth hit hardest when said aloud. She wasn't hunting ghosts anymore, she was mapping infrastructure. Because Senator Everett Grayson wasn't just a name at the top of the food chain, he was the architect. The records Marcus had dug up showed donation loops that curled back on themselves, like snakes, eating their tails. Campaign money routed through shell organizations, real estate deals awarded to firms that didn't exist a year ago, grant funding for law enforcement tech redirected to counties that never asked for it. It was all legal on paper, but morally it stank of rot. What chilled Lena wasn't just the scale, it was the intimacy. Grayson didn't just support Caulfield's re-election campaigns. He'd hand-picked the companies installing body cams in her department. He'd personally endorsed Hensley for tactical field training 5 years earlier, calling him the future of rural policing. That same year, Grayson chaired the committee responsible for reviewing misconduct reports filed against sheriff's departments across the state. Lena had to step outside when she found that. She stood on the porch, hands gripping the rail, breathing through clenched teeth while a thundercloud hung low above the tree line, ready to burst. She called Marcus without preamble. This man built himself a shield and wore it like a badge. Marcus didn't disagree. "He's 3 moves ahead, Lena. Always has been. You want to break him, you need more than smoke." "I've got fire," she said, her voice like a blade sliding back into its sheath. "Now I just need a fuse." That night, a message came through from an old contact Lena hadn't spoken to in years, a legal analyst turned whistleblower liaison, someone who'd once passed her a flash drive full of pension fund embezzlement details and then disappeared into the Federal Protection Program. The message was brief, encrypted, and attached to a file labeled Warehouse 17. No context, no sender name. But Lena recognized the digital signature. She opened it carefully, half expecting static or bait, but what filled her screen was raw surveillance footage, grainy, low-light, time-stamped 2 weeks earlier. In the frame stood 3 men, Grayson, Caulfield, and a third figure she didn't recognize. At first, a man in a dark jacket, military build, hair, buzzed, close eyes like bullet holes. No uniforms, no titles, just posture and presence. They weren't debating policy, they were planning containment. The audio was low, but clear enough to catch words that made Lena's heart lock in place. She's not just a problem, she's a symbol. If she speaks, it spreads. Then Grayson's voice, let her push. We push harder. Pressure, discredit, isolate. If that fails, eliminate the threat quietly. Lena didn't move for a full minute after the clip ended. The glow from the screen painted her face pale and hard, and the cabin around her felt suddenly smaller, like the air had been pulled out and replaced with something electric. She didn't feel fear, not the kind that paralyzes, but a deeper, quieter kind. The kind that hums inside your ribs and makes you double-check locks twice without even realizing. She forwarded the file to Marcus, then called Denise. You need to see this, she said. Denise watched it silently. When it ended, her voice was sharper than Lena had ever heard it. That's conspiracy, Lena. That's premeditated. I know. We take this to the Bureau. We take it now. Lena hesitated. And let them bury it for optics. Wait 6 months for a hearing while Grayson tightens his grip. Then what? Lena looked out the window, the stars blotted by heavy clouds. We go public. Controlled leak. Video. Timeline. Ties to funding. We show how far this runs. Denise didn't argue. She just said, I'll prep a summary for the Oversight Committee. But Lena, this puts you right in the open. I've been in the open since the kick, she said. They just didn't notice until now. That night, they built the story like you build a case, with dates, contracts, transcripts, footage. Not flashy, not dramatic, just undeniable. By morning, the files were in the hands of 3 journalists with track records for not blinking when the heat came down. One in Atlanta, one in Chicago, one in D.C. Lena didn't wait for them to call. She knew they would. The headline dropped at 9:06 a.m. State Senator. Linked to police abuse cover-up, secret meetings reveal retaliation plot. The ripple hit instantly. Cable news rolled out breaking banners. The governor called for immediate review. Civil rights groups called it the biggest breach of ethical policing oversight in a decade. Grayson canceled his town hall. Caulfield shut down her office's press line. And Lena, she stayed quiet. For the moment. Because now she wasn't just the woman who got kicked at a gas station. She was the storm that followed. And the people who'd thought they could keep their boots on her neck had just realized she wasn't lying still. She'd been pulling the rug out from under them the entire time. She closed her laptop, flexed her fingers, and stood slowly, her legs still sore, but her balance unshaken. The time for gathering evidence was over. Now it was about impact. Not just fallout, but transformation. And she wasn't walking into their world anymore. They were being dragged into hers. The morning Lena walked into the Benton County Courthouse, the air outside was sharp with the kind of tension that doesn't come from weather, it comes from people holding their breath. The steps were crowded, lined with reporters and residents, and folks who didn't know her name a week ago, but now held up signs with her face on them like they'd known her all their lives. Some were quiet watching. Others chanted not just for her, but for something they hadn't dared believe might actually change. She paused at the bottom step, the sky, a washed-out gray behind her, her coat buttoned against the wind, her badge clipped where everyone could see it, this time no longer hidden, no longer silent. She didn't bring a team, no entourage, no press secretary, just herself and a small folder tucked under her arm, not for show but for reference proof that what she was about to say wasn't story but fact. Her legs still ached, wrapped tight beneath her slacks, but she didn't limp. Not here. Not today. Her steps were even deliberate, the kind of walk that makes people step aside, not because they're told to, but because they feel the current shift. At the top of the stairs, the makeshift podium looked like something from a hastily planned campaign rally, cheap metal, too many mics, wires tangled like nerves. Marcus was waiting off to the side, arms crossed, sunglasses on, despite the overcast sky, the way someone does when they'd rather be scanning rooftops than posing for pictures. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a slight nod, and she answered it with a glance that said, "This is the moment we've earned." When she stepped up, the noise didn't fade all at once, but it changed. It bent. It leaned in. The crowd didn't fall silent so much as it tuned itself to her breathing, waiting for her voice, the way a storm waits for the first flash of lightning. "My name is Lena Whitaker," she began, her voice calm, low, and unwavering. "I serve as the Inspector General of Federal Law Enforcement Oversight." A few gasps moved through the front row, but she didn't pause. "I have spent the last 28 years tracking misuse of power, documenting systemic failure, and calling for reform in agencies that were designed to protect the people they often hurt instead." She took a slow breath and continued. 2 weeks ago, I was assaulted at a gas station, not because of anything I did, but because of what I looked like, and because someone in uniform thought they'd never be held accountable for it." Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It carried. "I didn't show my badge that day. I wanted to see how far they would go if they thought I was no one." She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning faces, some young, some weathered, many with hands clutching phones or posters or just each other. "He shoved me. He kicked me. Then he walked away." But that wasn't the story. That was just the match. The story is what came after. Camera shutters clicked like distant rain. Someone near the front said softly, "Tell it." Lena held their gaze and nodded. "In the days since," she said, "we've uncovered a system of abuse buried beneath layers of silence, powered by money and protected by influence. Sheriff Caulfield, Senator Grayson, Deputy Hensley, they are not anomalies. They are byproducts of a structure that rewards force and punishes dissent. This isn't about a few bad apples. This is about a spoiled orchard." The crowd stirred now, not in anger but in recognition. This wasn't rhetoric. This was anatomy, a slow dissection of power in plain view. She continued, steady as ever. "I have submitted a full report to the Department of Justice, including financial records, whistleblower testimony, procurement audits, and surveillance footage of retaliatory meetings where public officials discussed silencing me." Her hand hovered over the folder, not lifting it, just reminding them it was real. "I'm calling not just for the resignation of Sheriff Caulfield and the indictment of Deputy Hensley," she said, "but for a federal inquiry into every contract, every complaint, every ignored red flag within Benton County's law enforcement structure over the past decade." She let that sit heavy and honest. "This isn't about me," she said finally, her voice softening just slightly. "This is about every woman who filed a complaint that never got answered. Every man who got pulled over for the color of his skin. Every kid who grew up believing silence was safer than truth." The applause didn't come all at once. It swelled. It gathered like thunder in the chest. People weren't just clapping for Lena, they were clapping because someone had finally said it out loud on the record, without backing away when the room got cold. Lena stepped back from the podium, didn't wave, didn't smile, just gave a simple nod before turning toward the courthouse entrance. Marcus fell in beside her as cameras shouted questions they weren't going to answer. "That was one hell of a speech," he said. She didn't break stride. "It wasn't a speech," she said. "It was a declaration." Inside, the air was cooler, the marble floors echoing beneath their steps like memory. She didn't head for the courtroom. She went straight to the Federal Liaison Office where a sealed envelope waited with her name in black ink. She opened it without ceremony, scanned the contents, and handed it back. "Thank you," she told the clerk, then turned and left without another word. Outside, the noise had grown, more chants, more signs, more people. A movement, not because of her, but because of the truth. And Lena knew something most of them didn't, yet this wasn't the crescendo. This was the overture. The top of the chain had just been named. But power, when cornered, doesn't crumble. It fights back. She wasn't afraid of that. She was ready for it. Because now the whole country was watching. And Lena Whitaker wasn't going to flinch. The arrests didn't come with sirens or spectacle. They arrived early, just after sunrise, the air still cold enough to sting your hands and make your breath visible. Sheriff Marianne Caulfield was taken from her front porch in a blue bathrobe, coffee still steaming in the mug she held when they knocked. The federal agents didn't say much, just showed the warrant, stepped aside politely when her husband asked what was happening, then led her down the steps in handcuffs while the neighborhood watched in silence from behind drawn curtains. There was no shouting, no cameras, just the creak of old wood and the sound of her slippers dragging slightly on the concrete. 2 hours later, they pulled Deputy Travis Hensley from his driveway, chest puffed like he had something to prove, shouting that this was all political, that the feds had no right. But the agents didn't blink, didn't argue. They let him bark while they zip-tied his wrists and pushed him gently into the back seat. Lena watched the footage later, not with satisfaction, but with the calm that comes when you know the wheel of justice has finally begun to turn slowly and heavily but unmistakably in motion. By mid-morning, Senator Everett Grayson's office had been sealed off by federal marshals, but he was already gone. slipped out during the night flying east under a false name, headed for a private lodge in the mountains of Montana where he thought cell signals didn't reach and paperwork couldn't follow. It didn't matter. They found him before dusk huddled in a cabin built to keep secrets, pouring whiskey into a chipped glass and staring at a fire that wouldn't catch. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just looked tired, like a man who'd known for years that this was always how it was going to end. Back in Missouri, the courthouse was swarming with press and protesters, their bodies pressed tight against metal barricades, signs held high like shields. Every news network had a camera pointed at the building's doors, waiting for confirmation, for something visual to mark the shift from rumor to reckoning. And then Lena stepped out, coat-buttoned badge, clipped eyes, steady, not smiling, not waving, just walking with the quiet power of someone who no longer had anything to prove. She didn't stop for interviews, didn't make another speech. She raised her hand once, just a small, simple gesture, and the crowd answered without needing a word. They erupted not for her, but for what her presence now meant. Not revenge, not punishment, but exposure, truth, accountability. Inside the indictments were being read conspiracy to obstruct justice, abuse of power, destruction of evidence, violation of civil rights under color of law. One by one the names came forward. Deputies, clerks, contractors, judges, people who had operated comfortably behind closed doors now stood under fluorescent lights, blinking, shrinking, surrounded by the weight of their own choices. Lena returned to the field office that afternoon tired, but focused, stepping into the quiet room where Marcus and Denise were already reviewing the next round of leads. The mood wasn't celebratory. It was surgical, because they all knew what the headlines couldn't explain, that this wasn't the end. It was the point where power begins to mutate, to regroup, to whisper in darker corners and look for new masks. Marcus handed her a folder without speaking. Inside were names of potential successors, early campaign donors, PR firms quietly cutting ties, and legal representatives shifting loyalties like rats fleeing a flood. Lena didn't react. She just flipped through the pages, reading not for content but for intention. "They're trying to survive," she said softly. "Not because they're innocent, but because they think they still might win." "They won't," Denise replied, her voice calm but fierce. Lena nodded, not out of hope but out of resolve. She knew systems don't collapse in one clean blow. They crack, they stall, they adapt. What mattered now wasn't the fall of the guilty. It was the protection of the vulnerable. The rebuilding of trust from the ground up, one audit, one policy, one case at a time. That evening she drove herself home for the first time in over a week. The sun was setting behind the ridge, low and orange, casting long shadows across her porch like fingers reaching for rest. She parked in the driveway, sat still for a moment behind the wheel, then stepped out slowly, her knees stiff but her footing sure. The house smelled like memory coffee beans, cedar, a faint trace of lemon oil, and it took her a full minute to set her bag down, take a breath, and remind herself that stillness wasn't surrender. She turned on the television, not to watch but to witness. Grayson's mugshot filled the screen, grainy and flat, the weight of arrogance gone from his eyes. The news ticker ran beneath him, like a slow drumbeat. Federal inspector leads largest oversight case in state history. Lena turned the volume down and stood in the center of her living room, letting the silence wrap around her like armor. She'd spent years behind other people's curtains, helping expose stories that were never hers. Now the spotlight had swung around, and she hadn't flinched. Later that night, someone firebombed the front of the Benton County Sheriff's Office. No one was hurt, but the message was clear: not everyone was ready to let the truth live without a fight. Lena received the alert on her phone just before midnight. Marcus called 5 minutes later. "We've got a problem," he said, voice tight. Lena didn't ask what. She just asked where. He gave her the address of a warehouse registered to one of Grayson's shell companies. Surveillance teams had spotted unusual activity, lights at odd hours, armed men patrolling the perimeter. She didn't hesitate. She called it and coordinated the raid, watched from a feed as agents uncovered weapons, burner phones, files, photos of her, Marcus, Denise. Targets. They weren't done trying to silence her. But Lena Whitaker wasn't done either. Not by a long shot. Lena returned to that gas station exactly 1 year later, pulling in slowly just after sunrise when the world still felt quiet enough to hear your own breath. The pavement had been resurfaced smooth now, where once it had been cracked and sharp beneath her knees, and the rusted pump that had dripped fuel beside her that day was gone, replaced with something newer, cleaner, a sleek silver column that hummed instead of rattled. She stepped out of her car without limping, this time both legs firm beneath her, though the memory of pain still lived somewhere in the muscle, not as injury anymore, but as instruction. A soft breeze moved through the trees behind the lot, carrying the scent of pine and diesel, and something faintly floral like wild honeysuckle blooming too early in the season. She didn't come with cameras, or company didn't announce her visit or document it. This moment was just for her. Her shoes crunched on the gravel as she walked to the far side of the lot, where a small bronze plaque had been mounted into the stone, set low and simple, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. She crouched slowly, her fingertips brushing the edge of the metal, reading the words aloud under her breath. Here stood a woman. She didn't fall. The letters weren't elaborate, no title, no agency name, no quote from anyone famous. Just that single grounded sentence. And it was enough. She exhaled and let herself remember not just the kick or the fall or the sting of gravel cutting through cloth, but the silence afterward, the stillness that had held her like a question before the reckoning began. There had been a moment right there where she could have stayed down, let it pass, let the shame win, let the world keep spinning just as it was. But she hadn't. She'd stood. And that single act had become a thread that unraveled something bigger than even she had imagined at the time. Behind her, a semi rolled past on the highway, its wheels hissing against the asphalt, its horn low and distant, like a memory fading into distance. She straightened up slowly, the morning sun warming the back of her neck, and turned toward her car. The world looked different now, not because the landscape had changed, but because so many people had been forced to finally look at it. The warehouse was gone. The contracts were being audited. The senator's name was no longer on the oversight committee's letterhead. But Lena knew the truth. Systems don't die in the light. They just retreat into deeper shadows and wait, and so the fight would never really end. Back in the driver's seat, she sat for a long moment, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on her badge, still warm from her coat pocket. She wasn't with the Bureau anymore. Her resignation had been clean, firm, necessary. She hadn't left because she'd lost. She'd left so she could speak freely, act fully without waiting on permission that too often came too late. She opened her phone, scrolled through her messages, requests from law schools, veteran groups, community panels. Everyone wanted her to speak, to tell the story of what happened. But Lena wasn't interested in retelling. She was still living it. She started the engine, the rumble steady beneath her, and pulled back onto the road. Not fast, not urgent, just forward. And as the gas station disappeared in the rearview mirror, she didn't look back. Because some places mark you forever, not by what happened there, but by what you became afterward. And what Lena Whitaker had become wasn't a symbol or a martyr or a news cycle. She was proof that when you stand up, even from the ground, even with blood on your jeans and silence pressing down on your chest, when you stand and refuse to back down, something shifts. Somewhere something changes. And it may not happen quickly or cleanly or loudly, but it begins. And once it begins, it doesn't stop. Not unless we let it. And Lena, she wasn't letting anything go quiet again. What Lena Whitaker's story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to know the weight of silence, is that justice doesn't always come with a gavel or a badge. Sometimes it begins on a cracked pavement in the quiet defiance of someone who refuses to stay down. This wasn't just about a deputy who kicked a woman. It was about the system that taught him to believe he could. And more importantly, it was about a woman who knew exactly how to respond, not with rage, but with truth, discipline, and relentless clarity. For those of us who've seen decades of change and heartbreak, it's easy to feel like we've already fought our battles. But Lena reminds us, you're never too old to demand better, never too late to stand up, not just for yourself, but for the future, because silence might feel safe, but truth is what sets things right. So if this story moved you, if it made you remember something or see something clearer than before, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal, restore, and remind us who we really are. Because dignity has no expiration date, and courage that only gets stronger with time.